Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to number 112 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk About series. Today's topic is Let's Talk About Light Strike, Wine Scandal with Peter Richards, Master of Wine. Again, I'd like to extend a welcome to those of you joining for the first time, members and non-members. The Circle of Wine Writers was founded in 1960 in the UK and today has over 270 members around the world, with a split between 50-50 UK and overseas, comprising of wine writers, educators, broadcasters and other professional communicators. There's more information on the Circle website about details about how to join online and also more about details about the Circle of Wine Writers. I'd now like to introduce Rosemary George, who will introduce our speaker today, Peter. Hi, Rosemary.
Thank you. Well, Peter, I'm really thrilled to be introducing you today, because Peter and I met rather more years ago than either of us really care to remember, when he won the first, he was the first winner of the Young Wine Writer Award, which was set up by Adrian Webster, sometime towards the end of the last century. And so Peter, he was the first winner. I mean, Adrian, I think, as Oz Clarke's publisher, was looking for another Oz Clarke, but he got Peter instead. And since then, I mean, Peter's developed a fantastic CV as a writer, 4 books, broadcaster, presenting Saturday Kitchen, umpteen articles, and more recently, with his wife, they developed the podcast, with their wife Susie, a very successful podcast, Wine Blast, which last year won the 67 Pall Mall Global Wine Communicators Award. So it really is an achievement, a sort of global achievement. So as we've gathered for the conversation earlier, Peter's interest was prompted by the conversation with Liz Scabby about Light Strike and Rosé. And so podcasts ensued, and we're going to find, so Peter, over to you to tell us all about Light Strike, which is a very topical subject at the moment.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you, Andrea, too. And thanks, everyone, for joining. It's a real pleasure to be able to join you for this discussion. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in from all around the world, by the sounds of it. It's very exciting. First things first, can you all hear me, see me okay? Is the tech working? Got some thumbs up. Brilliant. Wonderful. Just shout if it doesn't for any reason. So I'd like to start by saying that Light Strike is a scandal, and we all need to do something about it. It's arguably the wine fault that has the most widespread impact, and yet we talk about it the least. Wine should simply not be sold in clear glass bottles. It's as simple as that. It's an issue that needs to be discussed. It needs to be aired. We have a duty as communicators who love wine to communicate about this subject and to help people drink better wine as a result, because that's in all our job descriptions, right? So I'm glad I've got that out of my system to start with. Wanted to get it out of the way. Thank you for helping. This is a sort of therapy session, isn't it? But, this is something I feel quite strongly about. There are so many headwinds facing wine at the moment. Neo-temperance, climate change, globally declining demand. We don't need to be scoring own goals as well. It's tantamount, this issue, to daylight robbery, and it needs calling out. So what are we going to do? What are we going to discover over the next hour or so? Well, when Liz Sags asked me to talk about this subject on the back of our Wine Blast podcast episode on Light Strike, I had one stipulation, and that was that this would be a discussion as much as a presentation. As you all well know, I'm not a sensory scientist or a chemist or an academic researcher. I'm just someone who, along with Susie, as Rosemary mentioned, has brought this issue to public attention. And we can all do that. This is a really important part of this session. So I'd be really interested to hear from you as to your thoughts on all of this and how we might best together address this issue more widely. Also, I'm very aware, having seen some of the videos and attended some of the sessions, that a lot of people who host these sessions have very slick and impressive PowerPoint presentations to share and for you to gaze at and watch while we do this. I'm afraid I have none of that. I've got nothing for you in that sense. So I apologize. I don't even really know how to share my screen. So unless you want to stare at my pasty face for the next hour, please do interject. It'd be lovely to see your faces, to hear from you, and to have your say. So, it's just so we can mix things up a bit. So to stop it all being sort of dry and polemical as well, I did suggest to Liz to do a bit of an experiment, a bit of applied research, as I like to call it, that anyone who was interested could do, which of course we can all replicate for our own audiences as well, if we want to demonstrate the often quite shocking effects of light strike. So I'd love to hear from anyone who has done that experiment in due course. I know Liz has, at least for one, so I'll be putting Liz on the spot at some stage when we come to talk about that a little later on. I think Andrea's very kindly offered to monitor the chat, because I won't have the capacity to do that, the old men and multitasking issues cropping up there. So if you'd like to chip in with a comment or a question, please do maybe stick it in the chat first, and then Andrea can just periodically interject with comments or questions, or we can bring you in if you want to say hello. I think that's the best way. But as Andrea said, I'm going to talk for maybe a little bit, then we're going to get into our experiment, which may be a natural break when we can all ask questions as well as talk about the experiment. So let's get into it. Light strike. Why are we talking about light strike? I think light strike is one of those issues that we're all aware of, but it tends to be quite peripheral in the wine world. So not really actively engaged with very much. It's like a dodgy uncle in the family, slightly awkward reality, but, that everyone seems happy to gloss over and pretend doesn't really exist, but it is there lurking. Susie and I guess, have been aware of it since we started studying for the Master of Wine. Then after we launched the podcast in 2020, March 2020, it was something that came up as a potential show topic. But then we read a research paper which really made us sit up and take notice, and we'll come back to that in a bit. At the same time, as Rosemary mentioned, we just happened to be chatting to Liz Gabay, our fellow Master of Wine and Circle member, who's currently doing her ironing at the moment, which is absolutely wonderful. Shout out to you, Liz, about that. And Liz mentioned that in her experience, around 30% of the rosé wines she tastes are tainted by light strike. A third. So just let that sink in a bit. 30%. This was a real eye-opener for us. If Liz, who tastes more rosé wine than probably any other human being on the planet, says up to a third of all the rosé wines that she tastes are tainted by light strike, then the scale of the problem is likely far more serious than we'd ever anticipated. Particularly given Liz, is something of an expert in these matters, so wouldn't be buying bottles off light-drenched supermarket shelves or shop shelves, or indeed exposing them to light at home, which I'd venture to suggest may well be the case for many drinkers out there. So we decided to take the plunge, Susie and I, and dive into the research, talk to as many people as we could, come from, I guess, as many different angles as we could, even going to the lengths of conducting a highly pseudo-scientific experiment at home, which is the one we're going to hopefully reproduce today, all to get to the bottom of this insidious light strike issue. And the result, well, I don't want to blow own trumpets too much, but the podcast episode, which was called Light Strike Wine's Not So Secret Scandal, which went out about this time last year, actually. It was Wine Blast Season 5, Episode 14, for the record. It made a bit of a splash. We had loads of reaction and feedback, and the programme was picked up in both the national and international press, from the Times to the Telegraph, Daily Mail, Classic FM, Gambero Rosso. Didn't get into the Daily Star this time, which we have done before. It's a bit disappointing, but hey, what are you going to do? Headlines included why exposing wine to the sun's rays is a clear mistake. Masters of Wine issue a warning, the hidden risk of clear bottles. And clear bottles can make wine smell like boiled cabbage due to little known phenomenon, experts warn. That was the Daily Mail, that last one. Very long headline in the Mail Online. Little known phenomenon. It would seem, from the international press coverage, together with the wider reaction on social media, we got that there is interest in this story, and not just from within the wine trade, yet it remains a little known phenomenon. So I guess that's what we're here to discuss, and that's what we need to change. So let's get down to brass tacks. What is light strike? Apologies for those many of you who will know this already, but I think it's worth just recapping. Put simply, light strike is when wine is tainted by light. Light is a friend to the vine, but an enemy to wine. A bit like kryptonite to Superman, I guess, but we're not going to get too far down the superhero rabbit hole, at least not yet. Welcome to some of that discussion a bit later on, if anyone wants to go there. We all know that wine is a complex chemical soup. It's one of the most chemically complex of all the things we eat and drink. But light, and particularly certain wavelengths of light, triggers chemical reactions in wine. The results can be very damaging very quickly. I'll come on to the research in a second, but in simple terms, light striking wine seems to have two major potential outcomes. One is the wine becomes muted, so aromatic or flavor compounds are degraded and destroyed. Essentially, the wine's character is stripped away. Another is that the wine can develop nasty aromas, often described as boiled cabbage, wet dog, or blocked drains, and there are many other epithets. You might not think wet dog's too bad, but that's a personal thing. Either way, exposing a wine to light can render the wine very different to how the winemaker intended and what the consumer pays their hard-earned money for. How and when does light strike happen? Well, during the winemaking process, of course, wine is protected, and rightly so. No winemaker wants his wines oxidizing or reducing or having any kind of spoilage issues. The issue comes after the wine is packaged or bottled, when the wine is exposed to light. Wine, it's important to say, can be tainted by light strike at any time it's exposed to light. That could happen in the winery if the bottles are left out too long under bright lights after bottling, for example, or anywhere along the supply chain. I guess, though, it's most likely to happen either at the point of sale, on shelves under bright lights, or in shop windows, or in all of those fancy restaurants awash with glorious natural light because they've got such funky steel and glass frames around them, or indeed at home, when people proudly keep their favourite bottles on show in their wine rack or brightly lit wine unit. And the issue here, of course, is the packaging. This is the key point. There's an easy way to protect wine from light strike and from light. In simple terms, stop the light reaching the wine. And how do you do that? It's all about what we put the wine in. Now, light comes in many forms along the electromagnetic spectrum, and this is where I'm getting slightly out of my depth, so I'm just going to whiz through this and hope no one picks me up on it. Of course, the electromagnetic spectrum goes from lots of things, from gamma rays to radio waves and stuff like that, but the light part of it goes from invisible, like UV light, to visible, to infrared, and then beyond, in order of smaller to larger wavelengths. The kinds of lights that are most damaging to wine are those with shorter wavelengths, in the UVA range of the spectrum, which is invisible, and then visible light in the blue range of the spectrum. For the light geeks out there, sure there will be some, I'm not one of them, but there we go. That's around 370 to 440 nanometer wavelengths. This is what's considered really most damaging areas for wine. And daylight, even through clouds, and bright white interior lighting, like fluorescent lights, are particularly damaging to wine. And it's simple, really. The better the barrier to light, particularly in those wavelengths, the more the wine will be protected. Essentially, the darker, the better. It's not rocket science. So cans, great. Bag-in-box, why not? If you're going to stick with tradition and go with the bottle, go the darkest you possibly can. A recent study found that dark amber bottles transmitted less than 0.3% of harmful light in the entire 320 to 440 nanometer light wavelength range. 0.3% for dark amber bottles. Light amber bottles transmitted up to 2%, between 340 and 390 nanometers. Bluish green bottles allowed just over 60% of damaging light through in the 360 to 390 nanometer range. Do you know what lets well over 80% of the damaging light through? You guessed it, clear, colorless, or flint glass bottles. They allow over 80% of the damaging light through versus 0.3% for dark amber. So clear glass, by my mathematics, is roughly 300 times worse for your wine than dark amber when it comes to light exposure. Now, how serious is this problem is a very valid question. So this is where we sort of turn to the research. Incidentally, there is a fair body of research about light strike out there. You may well have had a look already. You may well know it. It's a well-recognized issue, light strike, and not just for wine, but, you know, for beer, milk, olive oil, for lots of products. It just makes it all the more mystifying as to why we don't talk about it more, why it's not recognized more widely. But the paper that we refer to in our podcast episode is called Flint Glass Bottles Cause White Wine Aroma Identity Degradation. We interview one of its co-authors, who's also a winemaker and assistant professor on the podcast, the delightful Panagiotis Arapitsas. Their paper is based on research that's been going on for a long time, around 10 years, I believe. They've been publishing various papers. But this research has involved more than 1,300 bottles of wine in flint or clear colorless glass, together with controls. It involves a mock-up of supermarket shelving. It involves a big electricity bill from all the light they're using, a fair bit of gas chromatography, and lots of good old-fashioned tasting as well. So here are a couple of the key findings from this paper and other things that we report in the podcast. After 2 months in flint glass bottles, so clear glass bottles, Chardonnay and Pinot Gris lost their identity to the extent they became indistinguishable from one another. A kinetic experiment showed that the biggest changes happen within 7 days. So light strike can happen extremely fast, according to Panagiotis, who described that finding as a big shock for us. Grape-derived aromas like terpenes and norisoprenoids are really important in giving varietal character to a wine. But the studies showed that after 7 days, between 10 to 30% of terpenes were destroyed, and up to 70% of norisoprenoids were lost as well. Beta-dimacenone, for example, is a well-known norisoprenoid that not only has a generally pleasant smell, but it also acts as an enhancing agent for other positive aromas or characteristics in a wine. But beta-dimacenone is one of the most sensitive compounds to light, so it tends to be the one that's lost the fastest. So it's not just about the loss of individual aromas, it's important to say here, but also it's essentially the crumbling of the most fundamental building blocks of the wine edifice that's going on. The suppression of these good smells then leaves the door open to the bad smells, often the sulfur-containing compounds like dimethyl disulfide or methanethiol. And finally, the effects of light strike are irreversible and cumulative. So you can't rescue the wine once it's damaged, and more light just means more pain, basically. Now, Panagiotis is unequivocal. He says producers should not use flint or clear colorless glass bottles, and consumers shouldn't buy them. He had this brilliant line when we were talking to him. He said something along the lines of, we're living in a smart era, right? Of smartphones, of artificial intelligence, all that sort of stuff. But this, putting wines in flint or clear glass bottles, is an example of the opposite happening. It's stupid packaging in an era of smart tech. And I quite like that quote. It summed it up quite nicely. Panagiotis ended by saying, trying to hide the problem is not the right thing to do. Are certain styles of wine more at risk than others? Yes. Panagiotis and his fellow researchers were focusing on white wines because they're particularly susceptible to light strike for 2 reasons. Firstly, because they're more likely than reds to come in flint bottles. And secondly, because they contain fewer polyphenols than, for example, red. And polyphenols seem to have a protective effect against light strike. So the effects are more likely to be evident in white wines. But it's not just whites. Rosé wines can be just as vulnerable as whites for the same chemical reasons, and then potentially even more so given they tend to be almost exclusively bottled in clear glass these days. I want to add in here that sparkling wines, and especially traditional method sparkling wines, are particularly susceptible to light strike. And this has been known since the first studies on this subject that I can find anyway, which were published in the 1970s in Champagne. It's been known since then, this effect on sparkling wine, but bizarrely it seems to go under the radar. So I thought it's just worth re-emphasizing here. So the lees contact, particularly in traditional method fizz, can give elevated levels of precursor compounds that react particularly badly to light. The thinking is that light causes riboflavin and other photosensitive B vitamins to react with sulfur-containing amino acids like methionine and cysteine. And that creates foul-smelling compounds. I do love that phrase, foul-smelling compounds. I don't know why, but there we go. Like dimethyl disulfide, as we call dimethyl sulfide, hydrogen sulfide, and methanethiol. Plus, in addition to all of this, of course, in sparkling wine, those characters can just be more obvious because the bubbles tend to accentuate the aromatic impact of any off flavors. The result can be some pretty disgusting fizz. As anyone out there who's tried it will know, I can certainly tell you that. I might be coming back to that in a second as well. So on the subject of sparkling wine, just to throw in here quickly, Brad Greatrix, many of you will know Brad. He's the senior winemaker at Nightimber, lovely guy. And now Brad loves a bit of research, and he's looked into light strike at some depth. He is definitely someone who's been banging the drum about this subject for a while. As a result, Nightimber moved all its fizz from green glass to dark amber glass from the 2009 vintage. Brad says he never buys wine in clear, colourless glass. He says he's aware he might miss out on some potentially great wines, but the risk of taint is just too high. Most of you will also know or be aware of Tom Stevenson, the very well-respected writer, sparkling wine expert and founding chair of the Champagne and Sparkling Wine World Championships. Now, Tom introduced a safeguard of I have to try and say this with a straight face, of double bagging clear glass bottles in black plastic for the competition in 2015. And since doing that, the number of faulty bottles has dropped by 94%. Now, Tom says the following, doesn't mince his words, as ever. Clear glass bottles are marketing madness. Producers blame the marketing people, but it is fundamentally a quality control issue, and no self-respecting producer should allow marketing to override quality control. They should switch to dark glass bottles and move on. The best solution would be to ban clear glass bottles by law. Now, Tom advises people never to purchase a clear bottle of wine straight from the shelf, particularly sparkling wine. How widespread is this problem? Very hard to say, to be honest. But an anecdote. Susie and I went to two supermarkets to buy some bottles of mainstream wine to do our experiment for the original podcast. We wanted to focus on rosé because that's the style most commonly packaged in clear glass bottles. We needed to buy some rosé wine that hadn't been exposed to light. That was very important, so we could have a control against which we could compare the wines which had been exposed to light, but according to our rules. And you know what we found on that trip to buy rosé in a supermarket? I best bet you all know. So we went to two of the most popular supermarkets for wine in this country. I won't name names, but they were at either end of the demographic spectrum. We could not find a single bottle of rosé, still rosé, that wasn't in clear, colourless glass. In other words, every single bottle of still rosé in those supermarkets was in clear glass. On the shelf, under bright lights, none in boxes, which is of course an option we'll come on to. There was no choice open to us as customers to buy a bottle of still rosé in a dark bottle. And of course, there were also plenty of bottles of white wine, and guess what? Rosé sparkling wine too, in clear, colourless glass bottles. Now, we've already heard Liz's estimate that 30% of rosé wines she tries are affected by light strike. In our podcast, Panagiotis spoke of talking to the organisers of a big exhibition of wine in Italy, who reported 80% of the wines they were tasting out of flint glass at one event were light struck. Panagiotis said, and these are his words, "It's huge." So what's the issue with, clear, colourless or flint glass bottles? They're fun, right? They can be pretty, especially when it comes to rosé. They give people a clue as to what's in the bottle. Should we really be demonising them? I was speaking to one national on-trade buyer in the UK recently, and she said such bottles, and I quote, "bring the customer into the experience as a wine cue and provide reassurance." Now, I can see that argument. I can understand that. What I take issue with is the calculus that's been done here. The risk of the product being spoiled is being weighed against what are essentially marketing concerns. Will this bottle make someone more likely to buy it? And essentially, plenty of people, marketing departments and suppliers and retailers are essentially saying, we care more about getting sales of these wines than the quality, the inherent quality of those wines by the time they're actually drunk. I think, and this is maybe where people might want to take issue with me and have a discussion. This is absolutely fine. I think there's a discussion to be had here. But I think there's a very real danger of herd mentality here, of group think, that people are incapable, this kind of assumption, because I haven't seen any data. As far as I know, it's an assumption. People are incapable of buying rosé without seeing the colour first. So therefore, everyone has to do it. I don't think, well, I take serious issue with that assumption. But actually, when you think about it, there are also, when you think about the flip side, there are opportunities for producers or retailers to make a positive USP by saying, this is an issue. It's definitely happening. We are going to prioritize wine quality over marketing nonsense and have a big section clearly marked rosé, maybe with bottles with pink on the label or neck tags or whatever it is, or clear shelf markers or QR codes with videos. Colour tells you very little about style and quality anyway, and pretty much all rosés are pale pink now anyway because of the Provençal rosé effect. So why is it so important for people to see that colour is the question I would ask. Personally, I'd rather be reassured or have the reassurance that my wine wasn't disgusting rather than see a pretty colour on the shelf. But is it valid to say it's not always that bad? It's true that a small amount of light strike doesn't have to be terminal for a wine. Absolutely, that's I will admit that. Sometimes it can give a veneer of sort of herbal, slightly vegetal complexity to a wine. And in some rosés, which to be honest can be seriously bland to start with, maybe that's not such a bad thing, all right. And maybe even for some wine professionals, they seem okay with that, either because they're not aware of the problem or because they're okay with maybe a small amount of taint. But, I can't shake the feeling that the customer is the one getting the raw deal here. Customers pay good money, often, pretty damn good money for wine to be as good as it possibly can be, or the very least as the winemaker intended it. In the same way, we buy our bread or cheese or beer or yogurt, we have a right to have products in proper condition. The issue is, with your favorite cheese or beer or bread, chances are you know what to expect because it's familiar. But with wine, that's often not the case. People aren't often aware what a wine should taste like because the choice is so vast and it's hard to compare. So, they dutifully work their way through the wine, which might taste as sort of bleak and flat as Hackney Marshes in a March gale. But, they don't know any different. That smells like a rip-off to me, hence my quite strong language over this issue. Plus, with light strike, given how fast it can happen and how detrimental it can be, if that wine is in a clear bottle, you have no way of knowing how badly affected it might be. It might not be too bad, as we've said, might be okay, or it might be really, really bad. And that's the essential problem here. Now, I am aware I've been talking non-stop. So let's put this to the test. Let's have a bit of a breather. Before this tasting, I did suggest this to Liz, and I've mentioned this, that we could do this experiment. I'm just going to explain this a little bit. I'm going to have a go at it myself at the risk of falling flat on my face. Susie has done this for me blind. So a bit of jeopardy for us there. Maybe everything I've said is going to turn out to be complete nonsense. But I wanted to offer you guys the chance to do it as well, because I genuinely think one of the best ways of really getting a feel for this is to just taste it and get other people tasting it with you, because genuinely it's massive. Okay, so I wanted just to put some flesh around the theory bones that we're discussing. So apologies for the very bossy instructions I sent out to you all. I'm sorry if you feel browbeaten in any way, particularly Liz, who's definitely done this, poor old Liz, and had to cart them down to Portsmouth as well. Well done, Liz. You definitely get a gold star for doing all of that. But yeah, I mean, you know, this is not an experiment we'd all do every day, right? Because we're intentionally buying wine to spoil it. But what I say is, for those of you who have done it and are prepared to chip in with your impressions and conclusions, I would love to hear from you. I'm sure we'd all love to hear from you. So please don't be shy if you want to join in. But just to set the scene to start with, I've done the experiment myself, just with 2 bottles this time. The original experiment for the podcast was with 3 bottles. And I believe, Liz, you may have done 3, which is fantastic. But I've cut corners a bit this time, apologies. But we've got a sparkling rosé Prosecco here. I don't think the brand's important, but this one was from Waitrose. We had to buy it in a dark bottle, so it wasn't going to be light struck right from the start. This was incidentally the only rosé wine we could find in the supermarket that was in a dark bottle. So good on you. Our bottle, one bottle is the control. This is this bottle. So I opened, decanted this wine, and then put it back in its original bottle and put it in the dark for 9 days. The other bottle, which is exactly the same bottle as that one, I opened but decanted it into a clear glass bottle, which is this one, a sample I happen to have tasted recently. So this one, I did exactly the same process, opened the bottle, decanted it into this clear, colourless glass bottle, and then left it exposed to a combination of both daylight and artificial lighting for 9 days. I started this last Sunday. Now, Susie, as I say, has set this experiment up, from which she has poured these wines into a glass marked A and a glass marked B. And then I've got a piece of paper over there, which I can't see, which is going to tell us the truth. So I'm going to do this first. Let's just taste glass A. Okay, so this is a rosé, sparkling rosé Prosecco, as I've said. I'm expecting something fresh. This one looks kind of normal. Smells pretty fresh, pretty floral, sort of pear drop aromas. Slightly off dry, very much as I'd expect it. It's not blowing my socks off, but it's absolutely fine. It's quite fresh. Yeah, decent, juicy, solid, absolutely what I'd sort of expect from that wine. This is glass B. Oh, you can't really see there from the B. Anyway, there we go. Well, the first thing to say is this smells completely different. And that is a really, really important point to make. It's not the same wine for me as a taster. This one has got a completely different aromatic spectrum. It's much more dried herbs, dried fruit. There's a kind of funkiness and a flintiness. But there's also some pretty woolly, wet wool aromas in there, definitely. It's almost like peanuts, or, you know, roasted peanuts or cashews. It's not entirely pleasant, if I'm honest, and it's certainly not fresh and inviting, but I'm going to give it a go just for purposes of science. Bottoms up. Yeah, it's I'm just going to have another sip of glass A, actually. Yeah, I'm definitely on the side of glass A. Most important thing there for me, very different wines, completely different wines. If I tried glass B, which for me is the light struck wine, we'll find out in just a second. If I tried that by itself, I might be tempted to think, do you know what? It's all right. It's a bit vegetal. It's a bit herbal. It's a bit woolly and a bit kind of edgy, but maybe it's not terrible. I mean, tasting more and as it sort of warms up more, I think it probably would be unacceptable. But maybe I might let it get away with it. But tasting it next to the other glass, these are 2 different wines, night and day. So, right, the big reveal. I'm going to lean over to Susie's piece of paper. And here we go. So I said A was the proper one and B was the light struck wine. So it should be the clear glass. Let's have a look. And I think that says A control. Yes, that's right. Good. We're all right. We're all right. I've saved some face. Thank God. What little I have left. A is the control and B was the clear glass. So that's exactly as it should be as well. Incidentally, one other point to mention, and I'm noticing this as just I'm looking at them and actually putting that white piece of paper behind them. What's quite interesting in mine, because they're rosé, is the light struck wine, the one that was in clear glass, is significantly paler than the one that hasn't been light struck. And that is a telltale, if any of you want to know or don't know already, that is often a telltale piece of evidence when it comes to light strike, because as Panagiotis said, the effect tends to actually reduce the color intensity as opposed to oxidation, where where a white wine would go darker or deeper, and same with a rosé. Anyway, right, over to you. Liz, I'm going to come to you first off. So if you want to kind of maybe taste your wines and tell us what you're thinking of your experiment as you've done it.
Hello.
Which Liz?
I think I've got them here, Liz. So
Liz
is that
says,
okay?
yeah, Liz says go first. Liz Gabay, have you done the experiment?
Not this time round, no, but I have
No,
done
fine.
it before.
So we'll go to Liz Sags, who gets an A+ for her homework, as opposed to Liz Gabay, who gets a B-. So Liz Sags, over to you.
Well, the intriguing thing is I used a still rosé from bag in box, Cinsault Grenache, I think, from the south of France. And looking at the three glasses, the two that are exposed to light are actually a prettier pink colour than the control bottle, which is sort of slightly more yellowy pink, which I find surprising. And I have a quick sniff of all three.
But they are different in colour. So the control is different in colour from the other two.
Yes. The artificial light one smells horrid, sort of earthy and peculiar. The daylight one doesn't smell a lot, not too unpleasant, and the control is a not very exciting smell, but it seems straightforward, fairly sort of standard quality light rosé. I'll have a quick sip. It's quite reasonable fruit, a little bit of crispness around the edges, and quite decent length. That's the control. This is the daylight. It's a little bit blonder. It seems a touch sweeter almost. Less crisp around the edges, but not actively unpleasant. If I was served that, I wouldn't have thought there was necessarily anything wrong with it. And this is the artificial light one. Which is just a bit odd. It's got a sort of sweet sour flavour. It hasn't got nasty aromas or anything, but it's certainly the least pleasant of the three.
And how long did you leave those exposed to the light? Was it about a week as well?
It was a week, yes. I started Tuesday last week. I kept the artificial light on for more than sort of overnight, several days. The daylight one was on an east-facing but very quite bright windowsill.
It's interesting how with daylight, even in winter, when we did the original experiment, it was 4 days and it wasn't sunny for any of those days, and it was February, and it still had the effect. So it kind of brings it home when you've got full sunlight in a summer sense, then actually that can be potentially more damaging. But the important point there, Liz, is they're different, right?
Definitely.
And they're not the same wine, not as ordered or as the winemaker intended. I think it's a great idea using a bag-in-box, by the way, for this experiment. If it's a simple wine, presumably there's slightly less jeopardy because there's less character to lose as well. But certainly with our first experiment, what we found, I don't know what the science is behind this, but we found the bottle exposed to daylight just went completely flat It lost all its character, and the wine exposed to the fluorescent light actually had developed really quite actively unpleasant compounds, which seems to be chiming a little bit with what you're saying in your experiment as
Yes,
well.
not as extreme, but certainly different. And if I've just smelt the artificial light one before tasting, I really wouldn't want to drink it.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got an issue here. Thank you very much, Liz. And now, Heather, I know that you've done it as well. Do you want to chip in, Heather? Any sort of quick summaries that you'd throw in?
Yes. So first of all, sir, I've got an excuse about my homework, which is I only started on Friday morning, so I haven't done a full week, I'm afraid. So I started with, my control is a nice Chardonnay from Piemonte, because that's what I had, and I just open it to take a little taste. So that's my control. So it's not a hugely aromatic wine to start with. It's quite delicate, and there's a few sort of earthy notes, a bit of citrus and blossom, that kind of thing. And what I noticed straight away is for my daylight wine, that definitely is paler than the other two, which I wasn't expecting. So I'm glad you explained that. And my artificial light, I put that in my wine cupboard with the light on constantly the whole time. And the artificial light one is not actively unpleasant in any way. It's just completely flat, and not in an oxidized way, just in a, what is this? It's obviously a glass of wine, but it doesn't have a character anymore. It's been denatured. Whereas the daylight one, definitely there's a touch of that cabbagey thing going on, or a brie that is just coming into maturity. So depending on your likes and dislikes, it's actually at this stage it's not hugely unpleasant, because it might be, sometimes an aged Chardonnay, you might like a bit of that cabbaginess. But it definitely wasn't there in the wine when I opened it the other day, and as I'm tasting it today in the control. So this one, and the palate is uninteresting, but it's not completely stripped like the artificial light one, but it definitely has that cabbagey aroma to it and the change in colour.
And this is the thing, I think, isn't it? A, there's a change. B, it's uncontrollable. So you don't know how it's going to go or where it's going to go. Neither the winemaker nor anyone else knows. So it could be just about acceptable, as I've said, or it could be absolutely outrageously horrible. Either way, it's not as the winemaker intended. And I think that is why, you can describe it as quite an insidious problem, because for some people they might say, look, what's the big deal? But actually, I think this is a real issue. Is it going to kill anyone? No. But is it a kind of own goal for the wine industry? Yeah, I'd suggest it is. Why are we bottling in these formats when people could get a disgustingly cabbagey or just completely flat, vapid wine? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. But thank you very much, Heather. That's brilliant. Thank you, Liz. Does anyone else want to have a quick chip in before we move on?
Peter, yes, Jolanta has done an experiment. Jolanta, would you like to say a few words? Jolanta's done an experiment with premium champagne.
Oh.
Can you unmute, Jolanta?
Yes.
Okay.
So actually, I have had the experiment with a very nice and very good champagne like Crystal. And I had the effect even in 10 minutes. In the 10 minutes in the glass, when I came out from the tasting room and I tasted my champagne, it was absolutely different. In the 10 minutes, in the same glass. Crystal champagne, it was vintage 2008, very good vintage, by the way. The Crystal champagne had a taste of paper and carton box. And I think it's not possible to go out to taste wines outside in the light. I'm not talking about the bottle. I'm talking about the glass. So very, very premium champagne could be affected in 10 minutes in sunlight.
Yeah, in bright sunlight. You know, it's a very good point. We had that question came in. Look, you know, to what extent is therefore just the wine in a glass, in a clear glass, an issue? My response was, well, you got to drink quicker, but which is facetious, obviously. But no, it can be an issue, and I think if you're in bright sunlight, you just need to bear that in mind. You know, if you're going for a picnic, keep your bottles in sleeves, or protect them with tinfoil as much as you can, or use dark glasses, whatever. But yeah, it can occur in that format as well. So don't pour very large measures. Be careful.
Yes.
And obviously,
Because
as you say, but the issue with Cristal can be sometimes in the bottle previously, because people do tend to take it out of its box and its cellophane
but
wrapping.
actually the glass inside of Cristal champagne was perfect. But outside the 10 minutes, it changed absolutely all things. I think that champagne, it's most sensitive wine for sunlight.
Yeah, I know. I would agree that the research seems to suggest that for those reasons, that the lees contact can give these precursors, which can then react very, very quickly with light. So absolutely, I think one of the big messages here is that sparkling wine is massively susceptible. Even premium sparkling wine. You certainly don't want your Cristal, which is definitely one of my favorite wines whenever I can have it. You do not want that being light struck, do you? Because that is a crying shame. We had a story in from a listener who had exactly that. Actually, funny enough, it was with Cristal 08 as well. A friend of his had just kept the bottle, you know, taken it out and kept it on his shelf for a couple of years, and the results were predictably disgusting. But very interesting point. Thank you, Jolanta. A good point about, you know, this can happen in bright sunlight when you're just tasting in a glass. So I think we're just going to push on a bit quickly. I wanted to just give you a quick update on what's happened since our initial podcast went out. So I think it's our job to go out and spread the word, right? Evangelists, we're evangelists for wine, but we want people to drink good wine, okay? And this is one of the issues where we can help people do that. So after the podcast went out, one major producer of Provençal rosé had tuned in and told me he would be reassessing bottling in clear glass in the future. A German producer similarly pledged to move their rosé into dark glass. So, you know, there is hope. I think we need to see much more of this happening. So we all need to get out there and put pressure on people, especially when you look at, you know, premium rosé producers like Galopé, a Provençal rosé in a dark bottle, which I tasted at one of Liz's wonderful rosé the rosé day last year, or Clos Cibon at the same, you know, another delicious rosé that comes in a beautifully sort of quirky dark bottle. Many of you will know that wine, or indeed Liz and Ben's Gabay. Liz and Ben's rosé Sen from Slovakia in a very funky dark. Is it black bottle?
Black bottle.
Solidly black bottle, uncompromisingly black, wonderfully black, and a beautiful wine as well. So it is happening, and I think hopefully those producers can lead the charge and say, no, do you know what? We can make this stuff in a good bottle that actually preserves quality. But this does touch on something quite serious that Panagiotis said to me. He said light strike is an issue that many winemaking students and winemakers don't know about. He says when they understand the smell, many of them are shocked. He does a lot of teaching as well. And he adds, you know, maybe the worst thing is that researchers are currently writing projects proposing the use of UV light to kill microorganisms in wine. And you can see where that one is going in terms of the effect. I've also been talking to another major global wine suppliers company who's a leader in R&D, and they've confirmed, I'm keeping it very anonymous, as you can tell. I've been promised to anonymity. They've confirmed they are actively working on things to do with light strike, with specific reference to sparkling wine, but can't disclose what they're doing just yet. But it's not bottles. So keep an eye out for that news sometime soon. More papers have been published. A 2024 US study looked into rosé in particular and unsurprisingly found that it was negatively affected by light and temperature. The worst storage conditions for rosé were clear glass bottles under fluorescent lights at 22 degrees centigrade. In other words, your kitchen. Or a very warm supermarket shelf. A 2023 study from Hungary looked into light transmission rates through different types of glass. This was a really interesting study. And their abstract states, white wine in a flint or clear and bluish green bottles can survive only for a few days when displayed on shelves. Light amber bottles can serve quality for about a month, and dark amber bottles for more than a year. So that ties into the kind of light transmission rates I was talking about before. Another Italian study proposed using antioxidants like sulfur dioxide, glutathione, and chestnut tannins to protect wine from light strike. They seem to have some protective impact, but it wasn't really huge. And also that study didn't really consider the impact on taste or quality, which is pretty fundamental in my mind. How about instead of bunging stuff into the wine, just put it in dark bottles? Anyway, these studies all came to me via Panagiotis, so thanks to him for that. Incidentally, Panagiotis has been too busy to publish a follow-up paper on light strike just yet, because he's been working on a Retsina study, because as a proud Greek person, he feels he needs to be supporting Greek wines. So, power to Panagiotis and to Greek wines in general. Now, the guys at Pacamama got in touch as well. I don't know if you know Pacamama. They used to be Garçon wines. They make those, flat plastic or PET bottles that fit through letterboxes. They're working with people like Aldi and the Wine Society. Anyone who went to the Wine Society's tasting would have tasted some of the own label range out of these bottles. They're very proactive on the R&D front. They got in touch after our Light Strike episode to say that their colourless recycled PET bottles include a UV absorber, which removes some of the damaging UV and protects wines more than flint glass. So this UV barrier is master batch additive at 1% dosing, whatever that means. And it's incorporated into the bottle material at levels that mean recycling is still okay. Their research has shown that only 2% of light in two critical UV wavelengths, 340 and 375, gets through versus 80% for flint glass. So 2% versus 80%. And it adds only 2p to the bottle at most. Sorry, I'm getting some funny noises coming through. I don't know if
I don't know whether that's
just to say it's not me.
That's not me.
Anyway, they said
there are a number of questions.
Yeah,
I don't
go
know
on.
if it's got time to go through a couple of them quickly.
Absolutely.
Peter, one of them was Rosemary Brown was just asking about how many supermarket wine bars you've spoken to. They're buying massive volumes, and are they all saying the same thing, that clear glass brings the customer into the category?
It's always the same line. Absolutely, always the same line. This sort of groupthink mentality. Now, I'm very open to seeing the research that shows this is definitely the case, that people need to see the wine colour before they buy. I'm also interested to see how much the cost comes into it, because flint glass tends to be cheaper than dark glass and green glass. But yeah, I tend to get the same reaction. And this was actually the reaction of the on-trade buyer I was talking to. We don't want to be the ones to stick our necks out. It's too big a risk to change this now that it's there. We don't, we think that showing the color is important for people to see it. But like I say, they're all the same blimmin' colour these days. So I don't know what advantage you get by doing that. It's something that can't be communicated by other means, by label colour or by inventive, fun packaging. Heaven forbid we actually go fun and creative with our wine packaging. I think there's lots that can be done there. But I do think, yes, I do hear the same things. I think it's going to be very hard to change the existing mentality. All I can say is, what I keep saying is I keep asking these questions, and I'm definitely on it with all the buyers that I see. Let's all be like that, please, with all the people out there who are part of this issue, and just sort of suggesting these alternatives. Why not be the one to break rank, to do something that says to the customer, listen, we care about quality, we care about you. You don't have to see the wine. It's going to be much better in this bottle than that bottle. So yeah, like I say, it's hugely frustrating that when you talk to the big buyers, the big people with power, that you get knocked back with this kind of stuff. I think there's only one way we can try to change it, and that's just by keep banging this drum. And the more voices that do it, the better.
Keith Granger had a quick question, I think, or a couple of observations. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so we'll try, and there's a couple more questions as well. So you want to just have a quick word, Keith?
Yeah. Thank you. Congratulations, Peter, on bringing this topic to mainstream media attention. Really, really brilliant. And I agree with you on your assumptions that the public wants clear glass. There's the old song by The Jam, the public wants what the public gets, and which I think is very true. We've got to work much harder as an industry. One comment I got is that there's one thing in common to my mind with Lightstrike and TCA, and that is that low levels are a particular issue. So with low level TCA, obviously, the wine isn't going to taste musty or anything, but it's just going to be really flat. And that's exactly the same issue with Lightstrike. So if someone has a wine that is badly light struck, it's quite possible they'll return it, but at a low level they'll just think it's a crap wine. And the question I still have, and you partially answered, why is so little being done? I can understand at supermarket level for rosés in clear glass, but what about fine wines? What about sauternes in clear glass? That is absolutely crazy. Problem, as you say, has been known for over 50 years. I remember talking with Tom Stevenson back in 1982 on the very topic. And when I was doing research for my Wine Faults and Flaws book, reading the same papers you were, going right back to the 1970s, Mogin and Foyat, and the industry's known about this, but it's done absolutely bugger all about it. And I tend to think one of the reasons is that people at the sharp end, be they buyers, be they sellers, or even as wine writers and educators, do not talk enough to researchers and to scientists.
I remember at the IMW conference in Wiesbaden last year, some of the scientists issued a plea, which was, please adopt a scientist, to all of you MWs and wine journalists out there. So I think you're absolutely right, Keith. I think we should all adopt a scientist or a researcher, make sure we're in touch with them. There is a bit of a gap between research coming out, the scientific research, the academic research, and us. But it's fascinating. So I agree. It would be nice to see more bridges being built there and more interface between the two.
Thank you, Keith. There's been a couple of observations, or one of the questions from Claire Blackler asking about have you done any research on the use of bags, e.g. Cristal, and their protective impact? And then just a little follow-on from that, Jean-Marc Hodgkin said, Ruinar's second skin seems to be the ideal solution, protective, but allows a sneak peek at the beautiful colour.
Yeah, I mean, I have an issue with these is that they can be taken off, and people do. You know, if you have a nice bottle of wine given to you, like Cristal or Ruinar, are you gonna, and you want to show it off? Are you gonna leave it in its protective skin? I don't really think so. And certainly, Cristal gets taken out of its cellophane wrapper more often than not.
Just showing one on the screen, I think.
Oh yeah. Okay, I can't see it, but no, I mean, my point is that, the risk for you as the producer, let's take something like Cristal, hugely expensive wine to buy. You've gone to all that trouble. The wine is amazing. And yet, by leaving it in a clear glass bottle, you open yourself up to the possibility that wine could end up being light struck because people take it out of its packaging. Surely it makes more sense to put that in a dark glass bottle where even if people take it out, it's not going to be so damaged, to my mind. The Ruinar thing, again, I think we're in a world where we want less packaging, not more, environmentally, for so many different reasons. Put it in a lightweight but solid dark glass bottle, end of story. It doesn't need any more faffing around with. And so, yeah, that's what I tend to think about these things. I know that the Ruinar thing is a better solution than some alternatives, but at the same time, why are we using that clear glass?
And just one observation from Linda at Simpson. She was just saying that she reminds me of the resistance to screw caps, and that with help from us, the educators, consumers soon understood the advantages in terms of drinking. So it's just a case of, maybe, wine writers writing about it, spreading the word, and also the educators doing the same.
To my mind, it really is. And I've got a lot to thank Liz Gabet for. She said this, we need to raise this standard and get behind it as a wine trade, as wine communicators. I really, really think this is the case. We need to talk about it. We need to engage with it. Practically your question, Claire. No, I haven't actually seen any particular research about the cellophanes. I have heard, and I've heard from Roederer that it does work, but I haven't seen the research. But no, I mean, I think that, yes, this is something we just need to talk about. This is the issue here, is it just doesn't seem to be discussed or engaged with in the slightest. And yet, I think, from what I see, we're seeing more and more wine bottled in clear glass. And I think this is the wrong direction of travel for us as an industry. And I think we need to push back against it at all levels. And, for lots of wine formats or wine styles, maybe it's better to go bag-in-box. Maybe it's better to go in a pouch. Maybe it's better to go in cans, because they have the dual effect of being better for the planet and better for against light strike. So maybe that's one way to go as well. But no, this is definitely something we all need to champion. I think if I had conclusions, I would say we all need to, the number one is awareness. We need to be more aware. We do, and we need other people to be more aware of it. So that's our job as communicators, right? No more sweeping this issue under the carpet. Wine colleges, educational institutions should engage with this issue. I know it's on the syllabus at Plumpton, well done them, but is it everywhere? Is it in these wine colleges in Italy and France and Spain and elsewhere around the world? The OIV should raise awareness about the risks of clear glass. Winemaking authorities, the INAO should institute rules for appellation wines regarding clear glass, to my mind. Producers should just stop using them. Retailers should find other ways to sell rosé wines. I'm sure it's perfectly plausible and possible to do that. And finally, as wine communicators, what I'd urge everyone here to do is we should never buy wine in clear, colourless glass bottles, nor should we recommend such wine. So if you find me doing that, you can feel free to slap me or slap me down on social media. But that is, I think, something we should all commit to.